Under many names, one memory. Beings descended from the ancient sky.
We Watchers came down from Hermon to dwell among the sons and daughters of men.
In Mesopotamia they called us Anunnaki, offspring of Anu, descendants of the sky. In Greece they called us Titans, and worshipped us as gods.
In a Turin museum, an ancient Egyptian papyrus exists that official history chooses not to mention. This document states that gods and demigods ruled Egypt for millennia, long before the first pharaoh emerged. For centuries, we thought each ancient civilization created its own gods in isolation, distinct from one another. However, when comparing the texts from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Bible, a disturbing common pattern begins to emerge. Three peoples who never agreed upon anything describe the same beings descending from the heavens to the earth. The Egyptians referred to them as Neteru, the Sumerians called them Anunnaki, and the Hebrews spoke of giants and watchers. What if these three names were not separate myths, but rather three broken fragments of the same forgotten event? What you will discover next will forever change the way you observe the oldest ruins on the planet. To understand this enigma, we must begin with the most read and feared text in all of Western civilization. In the book of Genesis, within its 6th chapter, one of the most disturbing phrases in the entire Bible is hidden. The text states that there were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, during those ancient times. They were called Nephilim, a Hebrew term whose meaning experts still debate, ranging from the fallen to the overthrowers. The narrative recounts that the sons of God saw the daughters of men and took them as wives according to their desires. From that forbidden union of celestial and human, beings were born, hailed as heroes of ancient renown. For centuries, theologians fervently debated who these mysterious sons of God in the text truly were. Church fathers like Tertullian, Origen, and Justin Martyr argued that they were fallen angels from heaven. Others, like St. Augustine, defended the notion that they were merely the pious descendants of the ancient patriarch Seth. Even the New Testament recalled the angels who left their abode and were reserved for the final judgment. And in the book of Job, those same sons of God present themselves before the heavenly throne in the assembly of the heights. The expression "sons of God" reappears in various books, always associated with beings from the celestial realm. What is intriguing is that the Bible insists those giants did not completely disappear after the Great Catastrophe. Centuries later, when the Hebrew spies explored the land of Canaan, they claimed to have seen the giants once again. In the book of Numbers, they confessed to feeling like mere grasshoppers in front of the descendants of those beings. The city of Hebron was called Kiriath Arba in honor of Arba, noted as the greatest of all the Anakim. Only after fierce wars did Joshua manage to expel those giants from almost all the land promised to Israel. The Bible mentions the Anakim, the Rephaim, and the Emim as peoples of extraordinary height and strength. King Og of Bashan was remembered for an iron bed so enormous that it was kept as proof of his colossal size. And the famous Goliath, struck down by the young David, belonged to a lineage of giant warriors feared by an entire nation. The Hebrew texts referred to these giants as Rephaim, a name that also designated the shadows of the underworld. It is no coincidence that their land Bashan lay at the foot of the very same Mount Hermon where the Watchers fell. The Bible, therefore, does not treat the giants as a metaphor, but as a real and persistent presence in its narrative. However, there exists a much older and more detailed text that dared to narrate the complete origin of those creatures. That text is the Book of Enoch, an apocryphal work even cited by some of the earliest Christian writers. Enoch was the patriarch who, according to the scriptures, walked with God and was taken without ever knowing death. Although it was excluded from the biblical canon, its fragments appeared intact among the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran. The Book of Enoch does not speak vaguely, but offers names, numbers, and an exact location for the Great Descent. According to the text, 200 angels called Watchers descended to earth during the days of the patriarch Jared. They descended upon the summit of Mount Hermon, and there they sealed an oath together from which there would be no return. The very name of that mountain became linked to the curse of the pact that the rebellious angels sealed at its peak. Their leader, named Semjaza, feared the magnitude of the sin, which is why he forced everyone to commit to the same fate. Those beings united with human women and revealed secrets that mortals should never have known. Azazel taught men to forge swords, shields, and breastplates, and to extract hidden metals from the earth. Barakijal revealed astrology to them, Kokabel, the language of the constellations, and Sariel, the secret course of the moon. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth, Ezekiel those of the clouds, and Shamsiel deciphered the signs of the blazing sun. They also taught women the use of cosmetics and jewelry, spreading vanity and seduction among the people. Each gift concealed a trap, for metal became a weapon, and celestial knowledge turned into mortal pride. Astrology spawned superstition, and magic opened the door to lies and the false worship of idols. Thus, the gift of knowledge transformed into the root of the corruption that would ultimately condemn the entire world. But the fruit of those unions turned out to be something monstrous that humanity was not prepared to endure. From the women were born giants of enormous size, creatures that devoured everything that men produced. It is here that the text itself becomes uncertain, as different manuscripts disagree about their true height. Some versions speak of giants 300 cubits tall, while others multiply that figure to an even greater extent. Whatever the real measurement may be, all agree that their insatiable hunger eventually turned against humanity. When there was no longer enough food, the giants rose against men and began to devour them alive. The entire earth was filled with violence and corruption, and the cries of the innocent ascended to the very heavens. Those giants were also remembered as the mighty men of renown from the most ancient ages. The Book of Enoch adds a chilling detail about what happened to those creatures after their death. Upon perishing, their bodies left behind spirits that wandered the earth, transformed into demons tormenting the living. Other ancient writings, such as the Book of Jubilees, repeat this story and thus explain the origin of evil. From on high, 4 archangels beheld the spilled blood and brought before God the cries of the wounded earth. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel pleaded with the Most High to put an end to the corrupt work of the rebellious angels. Uriel was sent to warn Noah of the impending flood and thus preserve the seed of the righteous. Raphael was ordered to chain Azazel and cast him into the darkness of a desert known as Dudael. Gabriel was commanded to incite the giants against one another so that they would destroy themselves in a fratricidal war. And Michael was entrusted with binding Semjaza and his followers until the day of judgment decreed by the heights. Enoch attempted to intercede for the Watchers, but his plea for forgiveness was flatly rejected by divine justice. The fallen angels themselves, terrified, begged the patriarch to draft a supplication for them, directed to heaven. Enoch then ascended in visions to the highest heights, where he beheld the fiery throne of the Eternal Most High. The response was clear. There would be no peace or forgiveness for those who abandoned their sacred celestial home. The rebellious angels were chained in the depths of the earth to await the day of final judgment. And it was decreed to purify the world through a flood that would completely erase all that cursed lineage. The text even preserves a disturbing scene surrounding the birth of Noah, whose body shone in a strange manner. His father came to doubt whether that child was truly human. So supernatural was the light emanating from his face. The Dead Sea Scrolls also preserve another, even stranger work, known as the Book of the Giants. In its fragments, the giants themselves suffer terrible dreams that announce their destruction in a great flood. Distressed, they turn to Enoch to interpret their visions, but the verdict was already written in the heights. For centuries, the Book of Enoch was lost in the West, preserved only by the ancient Church of Ethiopia. It returned to Europe in the 18th century when traveler James Bruce brought back its first copies from Ethiopia. Up to this point, one might believe that this is merely a Hebrew legend, born in a lost corner of the vast desert. But hundreds of kilometers away, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, another people narrated a remarkably similar story. In ancient Mesopotamia, the land where writing was born, powerful beings known as the Anunnaki reigned supreme. The Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian tablets describe them as the true architects of the universe. They were considered molders of terrestrial geography, regulators of the stars, and judges of human destiny. Here it is worth pausing, because the real meaning of their name has been distorted over many decades. The academic translation of Anunnaki is simply progeny of Anu, meaning the princely descendants from the heavens. Anu was the supreme god of the firmament, and his consort Ki represented the goddess of the fertile and living earth. However, in the 1970s, an author named Zecharia Sitchin proposed a much more provocative translation. Sitchin claimed that the name meant those who came down from heaven to earth, attributing to them a stellar origin. Specialists reject that reading, but they acknowledge that it opened one of the most debated theories of our time. Beyond the controversy, the texts agree that these beings shared power with the first men. Among them stood out Enlil, the lord of air and storm, who presided over the assembly of all the gods. Also present was Enki, the god of wisdom, waters, and magic, the secret protector of nascent humanity. And ruling was Inanna, later known as Ishtar, the fearsome goddess of love and war, with no mercy whatsoever. Part of the Anunnaki descended to the underworld to judge harshly the souls of all the dead. Their creation poems, like the Enuma Elish, narrate how the god Marduk forged the world after defeating the forces of chaos. From the body of Tiamat, the primordial goddess of the ocean, the sky and the earth emerged according to that ancient vision. The myths tell that the lesser gods rebelled against the labor, and thus humanity was created to serve. Man was shaped from clay mixed with the blood of a god, uniting the divine and the earthly from the very beginning. When humans multiplied and their noise irritated the gods, they decided to annihilate them with a flood. These gods not only shaped the world, but also bestowed upon men the foundations of civilization. But there exists a Mesopotamian figure that bears a chilling resemblance to the watchers from the Book of Enoch. The Sumerians spoke of the Apkallu, 7 wise beings sent before the flood to instruct primitive humanity. These beings taught men agriculture, writing, mathematics, laws, and sacred astronomy. A Babylonian priest named Ursu described one of them, Oans, emerging from the sea to educate the peoples. In Assyrian palaces, they were depicted as winged figures holding a mysterious cube and a pine cone in their hands. Others were portrayed dressed in fish skins, just as Ursu had described the wise men of the sea. Just like the Watchers, the Apkallu imparted knowledge to mortals that transformed them forever. And, exactly like in the Bible, their story also culminates with a great flood that restarted the entire world. The coincidence becomes even more disturbing when we examine the famous Sumerian royal list of ancient kings. That document begins with the revealing phrase, "Royalty descended from heaven upon the first city, Eridu." From the very first moment, the Sumerians asserted that the power to govern had come down directly from the heights. That same text claims that, before the flood, certain kings ruled for tens of thousands of years each. After the flood, according to the same list, the duration of reigns plummeted to become almost human. And here arises another astonishing parallel with the Bible, which also recalls impossible ages before the flood. Methuselah, as noted in Genesis, lived nearly 1,000 years during a time when such lifespans seem unimaginable today. The Bible lists 10 patriarchs between Adam and Noah, matching the 10 kings Sumeria records before the Great Flood. The priest Ursu himself listed 10 kings prior to the flood, each ruling for entire millennia. To approach those gods, the peoples of Mesopotamia built ziggurats, artificial mountains of brick. The Bible recalled one of those towers, the Tower of Babel, as the human attempt to reach the heavens, defying God. And Genesis remembered Nimrod, described as a mighty man on the earth and founder of the first kingdoms. Some traditions linked him with the Tower of Babel and with the lineage of the powerful who followed the flood. The hero Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, was described as a being 2/3 divine and only 1/3 mortal. His epic presents him as a giant of superhuman strength who sought in vain the secret of eternal life. His companion, Enkidu, had been created wild, among the beasts, before being civilized by the hand of man. Together, they defied the gods and killed Humbaba, the gigantic guardian of the sacred cedar forest. On his journey, he found a plant capable of rejuvenating, but a serpent snatched it away, condemning him to death. That detail of the serpent and the lost immortality unsettlingly recalls the tale of the Garden of Eden. And in that same epic, the flood reappears, narrated by an elder whom the gods granted eternal life. That survivor is the Mesopotamian equivalent of Noah, saved from the waters within a great vessel. At this point, the coincidences begin to accumulate in a way that is already impossible to ignore. In both traditions, superior beings descend from the heavens and impart forbidden knowledge to humans. In both traditions, that wisdom corrupts the world and ultimately triggers a purifying catastrophe. In both traditions, the union between the divine and the human produces an intermediate lineage of extraordinary power. Is it possible that two such distinct peoples invented, by sheer chance, exactly the same sequence of events? Or are we perhaps faced with the fragmented echo of a real memory, transmitted through different cultural paths. That same pattern also appears in Greece, where the great heroes were born from the union between a god and a mortal. Hercules, Perseus, and other demigods are just another take on that powerful and intermediate lineage. And there is an even subtler trace hidden in the very language with which the Bible reached the world of the Greeks. When the Old Testament was translated into Greek, the word Nephilim simply became giants. With that term, the translators evoked the giants of Greek mythology who rebelled against the gods. The Greeks also remembered the Titans and the myth of Prometheus, punished for giving fire to men. Once again, the same scheme appears. Superior beings share a forbidden power and are punished for their own audacity. Even the Garden of Eden repeats the idea of forbidden knowledge that, when taken, precipitates human downfall. The serpent promised men to be like gods, the same temptation that the Watchers brought down from heaven. But we still need to travel to the third corner of this enigma, the civilization that names our history. We must reach Egypt, the land of pyramids, colossal temples, and gods with animal faces. Because the Egyptians also preserved the memory of an era when divine beings walked upon their own soil. They called it Tepi, an expression that is often translated as the first time or the primordial time. According to their texts, it was a golden age when the waters of the abyss receded and darkness was finally vanquished. The Egyptians imagined the origin as a hill emerging from the dark waters of an abyss called Nun. It is the same abyss of waters that appears in Genesis and in the creation poems of ancient Mesopotamia. In that time, beings called Neteru lived on the earth and exercised their sovereignty alongside men. The Neteru ruled from Heliopolis and from other sanctuaries scattered throughout the sacred valley of the Nile. The texts assert that they possessed supernatural powers and could appear as men, animals, or birds. Among them stood out Thoth, the god who, according to the Egyptians, bestowed writing and all knowledge upon humanity. Once again, a deity appears who teaches knowledge, just like the Apkallu and the Watchers of Enoch. But what is truly astonishing is not the oral tradition, but a physical document that we can still examine today. This is the royal Canon of Turin, a papyrus written during the reign of Ramses II, over 3,000 years ago. Unlike the lists carved in temples, this papyrus did not hide uncomfortable or forgotten kings. And in its most controversial fragment, it enumerates the gods and demigods who reigned before mortal pharaohs. The document attributes to those divine beings reigns that extend over tens of thousands of years. That impossible figure is exactly the same prodigy that the royal list of the ancient Sumerians already claimed. Two distinct civilizations, separated by deserts and centuries, record divine kings of impossible longevity. Egyptologists still debate how to interpret those numbers, but the text records them without the slightest hesitation. And then appears the detail that directly connects Egypt with the distant summit of Mount Hermon. Among the gods and men, the Egyptians placed a category of lesser deities called the Ursu. And the meaning of that Egyptian title, according to scholars, is exactly the same as the Watchers in Enoch. Pause for a moment to think about it. The same word used by Enoch reappears at the very heart of the Nile civilization. The Ursu were the intermediaries between the divine world and the human world, guardians of a much older order. Is it mere linguistic coincidence, or the trace of a shared memory among cultures separated by the desert? The connection is reinforced with Manetho, an Egyptian priest who wrote the history of his people for the Greeks. Just as Barroso did in Babylon, Manetho divided the past into dynasties of gods, demigods, and men. According to his account, the gods reigned first, followed by intermediate beings, until reaching human pharaohs. It is exactly the same descending structure that we find in Mesopotamia and in the ancient biblical traditions. First, the celestial beings, then a hybrid and superior lineage, and finally, fragile mortal humanity. The Egyptians also remembered the followers of Horus, a superior lineage that preceded human kings. And each pharaoh proclaimed himself the living embodiment of the god Horus, a direct heir of that primordial divine lineage. Another document, the Palermo Stone, also preserves the trace of rulers long before known history. But where are the Egyptian giants that give title to this story and that have so obsessed seekers? Here we must be honest and carefully separate the documented memory from simple modern invention. Photographs of colossal skeletons found in Egypt are, for the most part, fabrications that have already been debunked. In antiquity, moreover, the fossilized bones of enormous animals were often confused with the remains of giants and heroes. However, the idea of a race of superhuman stature was etched into the very stone of their monuments. Egyptian art depicted their gods and pharaohs with colossal proportions compared to mere mortals. Historians explain that it was a hierarchical convention, a way to show power through size. But to the ancient gaze, those colossal figures confirmed that the gods had indeed been real giants. The Greeks, upon arriving in Egypt, gathered tales about gods like Osiris, described with a portentous stature. It was said that Osiris was a civilizing king who taught agriculture before being betrayed and then murdered. Once again, it is the figure of the superior being who delivers knowledge and then falls victim to betrayal. His wife Isis brought him back to life just in time to conceive Horus, the avenger and heir to his throne. The texts inscribed in the Temple of Edfu speak of primordial beings who founded the sacred places of the world. According to those texts, after a cataclysm, those first gods rebuilt the earth upon the waters of the abyss. Those divine builders were called the Seven Wise Ones, a direct echo of the seven Apkallu of Mesopotamia. It is the same scheme of destruction and rebirth that we find in the flood narratives of the Bible and Mesopotamia. And upon the Giza plateau, the Great Pyramid stands oriented towards the cardinal points with enormous precision. Its faces align with the cardinal points with a margin of error that barely reaches a fraction of a degree. Many wonder how such an early people achieved such accuracy without the tools of the modern era. The answer from the Egyptians themselves was always the same. That knowledge came from the gods of the beginning of time. The ancient pyramid texts describe the pharaoh ascending to the heavens to join the eternal stars. His destiny was to reunite with Osiris in the constellation of Orion, closing the circle between heaven and earth. Some researchers even argue that the Sphinx shows signs of water erosion from a remote antiquity. Egyptology rejects that idea, but the debate keeps alive the suspicion of a much older and lost civilization. Thus, the Egyptian giant is not so much a lost skeleton, but the persistent shadow of those primordial beings. Now let us gather the three pieces of this puzzle that we have been uncovering throughout our journey. In the Bible, celestial beings descend, mingle with humans, and engender the fearsome giants known as Nephilim. In Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki and the Apkallu descend from the heavens, instructing men and preceding a great flood. In Egypt, the Neteru and the Ursu watchers governed the earth for millennia before mortal pharaohs. Three civilizations that did not share language or borders narrate the same arrival of superior beings from the sky. All three describe the delivery of a transformative knowledge that elevated and at the same time corrupted all of humanity. And all three, independently, place a great flood as the final point of that era of giants. Even their records of kings coincide in the impossible reigns of tens of thousands of years before the flood. It is as if three distinct peoples had inherited the same narrative, telling it each in their own sacred language. And they are not the only cultures that preserve the memory of a flood that erased a previous and corrupt humanity. In India, in China, and in ancient America, dozens of peoples narrate a flood that punished human arrogance. And from Mexico to the Far East, peoples with no contact whatsoever built pyramids as bridges to the gods. Everywhere, humanity seems to remember a time when heaven and earth were much closer together. Almost all those traditions also recall a lost golden age in which gods and men coexisted together. And almost all point to the same essential sin, mixing what heaven had ordered to remain eternally separate. The Nephilim of the Bible, the Anunnaki of Sumeria, and the Neteru of Egypt could be three names for a single mystery. Three distinct masks placed over the same face, a face that humanity has not entirely managed to forget. And that face appears in every ruined temple, in every broken tablet, and in every verse that speaks of the beginning. Given such a pattern, it is not surprising that bold theories like that of ancient astronauts emerged. Their proponents argue that those gods were actually visitors arriving from another point in the cosmos. Academic science rejects that hypothesis due to the lack of material evidence that can support it rigorously. But even discounting the extraterrestrial, the essential enigma remains intact and continues to demand an answer. Why did isolated peoples coincide so precisely in describing these beings descended from the heavens? There is an explanation that does not require ships or distant planets, and that many believers consider the most reasonable. Perhaps all these cultures preserved, distorted by time, the memory of the same true event. A moment when the celestial and the earthly touched, leaving an indelible wound in the memory of humanity. The Bible narrates it as the fall of the Watchers and the birth of the Nephilim before the great universal flood. Mesopotamia and Egypt would have preserved that same echo, dressing it in the garments of their own local gods. In this light, myths cease to be fantasies and become windows into a remote and shared reality. They would not be whimsical inventions, but fragmented testimonies of a past that official history avoids looking at. For those who respect the truth of the Bible, these coincidences are not a threat, but a silent confirmation. The pagan texts would be, unknowingly, unwitting witnesses to an event that the scriptures had already revealed. What Israel remembered with fear as a sin, other peoples mistakenly revered as if it were divinity. According to an ancient idea, the gods of paganism were nothing more than those dead giants, elevated to divine rank. And perhaps therein lies the deepest warning of the entire narrative about those beings descended from the ancient heavens. That possibility compels us to contemplate the ancient world with a humility and curiosity that are entirely new. Because if the account is true, then our species shared the earth with beings that we barely comprehend today. Think of the civilizations that built pyramids and ziggurats, aligned with the stars with astonishing precision. Think of the knowledge of astronomy and mathematics that appears almost suddenly at the dawn of history. Where did that wisdom come from that seems to arrive fully formed without a clear trace of previous gradual learning? In southern Turkey, a sanctuary called Göbekli Tepe was carved over 11,000 years ago on a bare hill. Its enormous stone pillars were erected by hunters who had not yet mastered agriculture or writing. That impossible temple is thousands of years older than the pyramids and the stone circle of Stonehenge. Some have, not without controversy, wanted to see in that sacred hill the memory of the very Garden of Eden. Whatever its purpose, someone possessed advanced knowledge in an era we believed to be sunk in barbarism. The ancient texts always respond with the same phrase: "It was the gods who taught us all these arts." It is the same answer in Sumeria, in Egypt, and in the pages of the Book of Enoch, repeated through the millennia. Every time archaeology removes a layer of sand, the remote past seems to become stranger, not simpler. And in that silence of stone, the old questions about our true origins return with more force than ever. Every new excavation deepens the mystery, drawing us closer yet further from the truth simultaneously. Perhaps that is why these stories continue to fascinate us, because they touch upon a question we have yet to answer. The question of who we really were in that lost dawn, and who walked alongside us then. Perhaps the history we were taught is the last page of a book whose first leaves were torn out. And thus the title that opened this story ceases to be a simple question and becomes a disturbing possibility. The giants of other times would not be foreign peoples, but the very memory shared by Egypt and the Bible. Almost all those cultures also believed that the gods departed one day, promising to return at the end of time. What Egypt revered as primordial gods would be the same that Israel remembered with fear as the Nephilim. In the end, each civilization preserved its fragment of a story too great to fit into a single tradition. If this enigma has awakened your curiosity, subscribe to continue discovering together the great forgotten mysteries.